Grandpa, Mommy cries so much. She has been hurt many times. My 3-year-old grandson whispered those words into my ear as I stood in the hallway of my own estate, only 40 minutes before I was supposed to marry the woman waiting at the far end of that hallway in an ivory wedding dress. 400 guests were already sitting in their places. The string quartet was tuning their instruments beneath the old oak tree, and I was about to discover that almost everyone I trusted had been keeping the truth from me for 2 full years.
My name is George Harland. I built Harland Estate with my own hands and just $23, and 3 years before that morning, I buried my wife, Margaret. Grief does strange things to a 65-year-old man. It creates a hunger for warmth, companionship, and someone to sit beside you at the end of a long day. Sometimes that hunger becomes so strong, but it makes you overlook things you would normally notice. That hunger was exactly what Diane Mercer discovered when she entered my life 5 months after Margaret's death. Diane was elegant, intelligent, confident, and warm in all the ways that seemed important. She knew exactly what to say when I was lonely. She knew when to touch my hand and when to simply sit beside me in silence. She made me feel as though I had found a second chance. What I didn't notice was the exact moment her expression changed whenever my back was turned. I didn't see it. Someone else did. That morning, standing in the hallway, my grandson Cody tugged gently on my hand. His little fingers were wrapped around mine, and his voice was barely more than a whisper. He told me that his mother cried almost every night when she thought nobody could hear her. Then, almost as if he were telling me about a toy he had found, he pulled out his mother's tablet and said that he had recorded something by accident. Something about me. I took the tablet from him. I didn't open it. Instead, I handed it to Sarah, my housekeeper of 20 years, who had appeared behind me without saying a word. Sarah had always been that way. Whenever something needed to be handled quietly, she seemed to appear before anyone even called for her. I looked at her and said, "Get my brother Bobby, my head of security Marcus, and my oldest friend, Dr. Peter Walsh." Then I added, "Meet me in the security office. Come quietly." I turned away from them, straightened my jacket, took one slow breath, and started walking toward my own wedding. By then, a decision was already taking shape inside me. But to understand what happened in that chapel, you need to know what happened before that morning. You need to understand how easily I became blind to the things happening around me, and how my own family was slowly coming apart while I thought everything was fine. I met Diane at a charity dinner that my brother Bobby had practically forced me to attend 5 months after Margaret's funeral. Diane was 50, composed, graceful, and extremely attentive. She listened to me in a way that reminded me of Margaret. She didn't just hear my words, she listened. I told myself that this was simply something good people knew how to do. I didn't stop to wonder whether listening could also be a learned skill, something a person could use to make another person feel understood. What I didn't see, but Sarah noticed almost immediately, was what happened every time I left the room. The warmth disappeared from Diane's face. It didn't slowly fade. It vanished. One moment, she was smiling and speaking softly. The next, her eyes became cold and focused. Then came the careful questions directed at my daughter Emily. Questions about estate accounts, insurance beneficiaries, succession plans, property ownership, future control of the business. She asked them casually over coffee, so casually that nobody felt as if they were being questioned. Diane wasn't falling in love with what I had built. She was studying it. She was mapping it. Within a year, Diane had moved into Harland Estate, socially and then practically. Little by little, she began changing things. First, she replaced the photograph of Margaret and me that had always hung at the top of the staircase. She called the change a kindness. She told me that the old photograph looked dated, and that she would have it properly restored for Emily later. I accepted that explanation. Then, Margaret's coffee disappeared from the kitchen. Her favorite ceramics disappeared. Her needlepoint disappeared. Over a period of 3 months, 17 small pieces of my late wife's life were quietly boxed up and removed from the house. I noticed none of it. Then Diane suggested we open a joint checking account. She said it would simplify our finances. I agreed. Over the next 18 months, nearly $240,000 disappeared from that account in carefully planned amounts. Each withdrawal was small enough not to trigger a bank alert or raise immediate suspicion. The money was being sent to a cousin in Baton Rouge, who, as far as I knew, had no clear reason to need it. At the same time, my daughter Emily was dealing with something even worse. Emily was smart, successful, and strong. By the age of 28, she had become a director at her firm. She had always been independent, the kind of woman Margaret would have been proud of. In 2021, Emily married a man named Trevor Holloway. Margaret met Trevor once before she died. She only needed one dinner to make her judgment. She looked at me afterward and said, "That young man has never built anything with his own hands." She was right, as she usually was. I didn't pay enough attention to the warning. Trevor didn't destroy Emily's independence in one dramatic act. He dismantled it slowly, one reasonable-sounding suggestion after another. Her job was making her anxious, he told her. She needed to slow down. Cody needed stability. She was spending too much time with people who didn't understand what she was going through. Friends became inconvenient. Then they became exhausting. Eventually, they simply disappeared from her life. Whenever Emily tried to maintain a friendship, Trevor had an explanation for why that person was bad for her. He made every restriction sound like concern. He wasn't controlling her, he said. He was protecting her. In late 2023, Emily broke down twice during an especially exhausting week. Trevor recorded her while she was struggling. He didn't record her because he wanted to help her. He recorded her so he could tell her friends that she was unstable and shouldn't be contacted. He called it protection. It was actually architecture. He was building walls around my daughter and convincing her that she had built those walls herself. Emily tried to reach me 3 times. The first attempt was a handwritten letter she mailed herself. It never reached me. The second was a phone call made from someone else's phone. Diane overheard the conversation and told Trevor about it before the night was over. After that, Emily stopped trying. Not because she had given up, because she had calculated the situation correctly. She had no proof. And she knew nobody was likely to believe her over her own husband and my fiancé. While all of this was happening, Sarah quietly began building a case that I didn't even know I would eventually need. In March of 2024, while cleaning out an old storage room, Sarah found a folded newspaper from Atlanta, dated 2014. The headline caught her attention. A prominent developer named Harold Mercer had died suddenly at the age of 71, just 14 months after entering his second marriage to a considerably younger woman named Diane. There had been an inquiry. It had been opened and eventually closed without charges. The widow cooperated with investigators and later relocated. Sarah sat alone with that newspaper for a long time. Then she called my brother Bobby. They didn't come to me immediately. They didn't have enough. So they waited. They watched. They documented. Sarah started writing everything down in a small Navy notebook she had been keeping since the previous August. Every date, every conversation she overheard, every strange request, every financial question, every change in Diane's behavior, every time Diane's real expression appeared the moment I turned my back. Meanwhile, Marcus began watching Trevor. The security logs showed a silver sedan appearing at my gate 11 times over a 6-month period. Every single visit happened when I was away. And every time, Trevor personally met the driver. He didn't have the man properly escorted by staff. That was a clear violation of security protocol. Marcus noticed, and that violation told him more than Trevor probably realized. Then came a call from my business partner of 11 years, Raymond Sutherland. His voice was careful and embarrassed. He asked me about the $40,000 he had lent Trevor. Raymond believed I knew about the loan. He believed I supported it. I knew absolutely nothing. And then I discovered Raymond wasn't the only one. 7 of my business partners had been approached in exactly the same way. Trevor never forged my signature. He didn't need to. He simply borrowed my reputation. He used the trust people had in me and allowed that trust to do the work for him. By any honest definition, that was fraud. Even if no signature had been forged, and even if some of the agreements had only been verbal. Then, in August, Marcus caught Trevor on camera doing something that changed the entire situation. At midnight, Trevor used a key I had given him years earlier during an ordinary moment of trust and generosity. He entered my private document room. He wasn't alone. A man carrying a briefcase came in with him. The 2 men stayed inside for several minutes. When they left, the man was carrying a manila envelope that had not been in his hands when he entered. Marcus traced the man's identity. He was a contracted attorney working for a company called Holloway Consulting. The company had been incorporated only 8 months earlier. Trevor was listed as its principal. Then we discovered something even more troubling. My articles of incorporation had been moved. Nothing appeared to be missing yet, but someone was preparing documents. Someone was preparing something for me to sign. And whoever was behind it was waiting for the perfect opportunity. Eventually, it became clear what that opportunity was going to be: my wedding. In September, my oldest friend, Dr. Peter Walsh, called me on a Sunday evening. His voice had a careful tone I recognized immediately. After 30 years of friendship, I knew when Peter was worried. During Emily's physical examination, he had noticed fresh bruising around her wrist. Emily told him it was from a cabinet
door. Peter didn't believe her, but legally, he couldn't tell me anything without Emily's consent. 2 weeks later, she gave him that consent. She asked him to be prepared to speak on the record if the situation ever required it. Peter told me something I have never forgotten. She was protecting you even then, he said. You already know what to do. You've known since Cody told you. He was right. I did know. 3 weeks before the wedding, Emily finally told me everything herself. We were sitting in the library. She told me about the isolation. She told me about the breakdowns Trevor had recorded. She told me about the letter that never arrived. She told me about the phone call Diane had overheard. And then she told me something that still hurts when I think about it. It happened in January. Emily had gone into Trevor's office looking for Cody's insurance papers. Instead, she found Trevor and Diane standing close together. They weren't discussing household arrangements. Their voices and body language made that clear. Diane turned toward Emily. She remained completely calm. She didn't panic. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she asked Emily whether she really wanted to be the person who destroyed everything her grieving father had finally managed to rebuild. Emily simply nodded. Then she walked away. She said nothing. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't care, but because two calculating people had made her terrified of the very person who could have helped her. They had convinced her that coming to me would destroy my life. By the night before my wedding, I finally had everything. Sarah's Navy notebook, Marcus's photographs, security records, call logs, Peter's medical observations, Raymond's testimony, the newspaper from Atlanta. I gathered everything in the security office at 11 that night. For 2 hours, we went through the evidence piece by piece. One fact alone could have been explained away. One strange phone call could be dismissed. One unusual withdrawal could be called a mistake. One suspicious visitor could be called a friend. But when everything was placed together, it became impossible to ignore. The evidence painted a picture of two people who had spent 2 years inside my family, quietly working toward one objective: my money, my estate, my business, my reputation. And they were only one morning away from getting what they wanted. Afterward, I went back to my study. I want to explain what I felt sitting there alone. Because it wasn't rage. Not yet. It was grief. A different kind of grief. I was grieving everything I had allowed to happen, even though I had allowed it without knowing. I had opened the financial account. I had given Trevor the key. I had trusted Diane. I had listened when Trevor suggested, in the most reasonable voice imaginable, that Emily wasn't stable enough to be trusted with responsibility. I had believed him. I had helped create the circumstances that allowed them to hurt my daughter. I sat at my desk and looked at Margaret's photograph. For a long time, I didn't say anything. Then I spoke to her the only way I still could. I asked whether I was doing the right thing. Deep down, I already knew the answer. That night, I made 3 private promises to myself. That night, I made 3 private promises to myself. First, I would tell Emily the truth myself. Second, I would protect Cody from ever having to carry the weight of what had almost happened around him. Third, I would put Margaret's photograph back on the staircase before the week was over. And that brings us back to the hallway. Back to Cody's small hand wrapped around mine. Back to his worried little voice. Back to the tablet he had accidentally recorded. That tablet didn't create my suspicions. It confirmed what I already knew. 40 minutes later, I walked into my own wedding exactly on schedule. 400 guests were waiting. The music was ready. The decorations were perfect. Diane was standing at the end of the aisle in her ivory dress. To everyone else, I looked like a calm, happy groom who had made peace with his future. Nobody looking at me would have guessed what had happened in the hallway. Nobody knew that the man walking toward the altar had already discovered the truth. Bobby was there. Sarah stood quietly nearby, her Navy notebook hidden inside her coat. Marcus was watching every entrance and exit, and Peter was ready with the medical records and his testimony. I looked toward the woman I had planned to marry. For 2 years, she had been watching my house, my money, my family, and my weaknesses. She believed she knew exactly how this morning would end. She believed that grief had made me easy to control. She believed Emily was isolated. She believed Trevor had already secured the pieces she needed. And most importantly, she believed I was still blind. But she had made one mistake. She underestimated a 3-year-old boy. Cody had told me the truth before anyone else could stop him. And now, as I stood there in front of 400 guests, I knew the wedding was no longer going to be the ceremony Diane expected. It was going to be the moment everything she had carefully built began to collapse. Marcus had been at his post since 6 that morning. He had not moved from the place where I had asked him to wait. Raymond was there too, along with the 2 other partners Trevor had borrowed against. They were seated quietly among the guests, looking like ordinary people who had simply come to attend a wedding. But they were not there only to watch a ceremony. They were there to bear witness. They had come to see the truth finally placed in front of everyone, without excuses, without private conversations, and without anyone being able to change the story afterward. At 9:40, Cody found me again, near the chapel steps. He was holding the same tablet in both hands. His face had that same serious look he had carried earlier, as if he understood that what he had discovered was important, even if he did not fully understand why. He brought it to me with the same solemn trust he had shown before. I crouched down so I was at his level. I thanked him quietly. Then I told him that he had done exactly the right thing. I wanted him to hear those words clearly. He had not done anything wrong. He had not caused trouble. He had simply found something that needed to be found and had trusted the right person with it. Across the garden, Emily was watching me take the tablet from him. She had been standing there quietly, almost as if she was afraid to believe that the moment had finally arrived. I looked across the distance between us and gave her the smallest nod. It was barely a movement. Most people would not even have noticed it. But Emily understood. Something inside her finally let go. For the first time in a very long time, she did not look like someone waiting for permission to breathe. I asked the officiant to step aside for a moment. He looked confused, but he did what I asked. The chapel was already beginning to fill. People moved into their seats. Family members whispered to one another. Guests smiled and adjusted their clothes. Everyone believed they knew what they had come to see. They thought they were about to watch a wedding. They thought they were going to see two people make promises in front of their families and friends. 400 faces were waiting for that wedding to begin. 400 people were expecting music, vows, flowers, photographs, and the usual happiness that comes with a wedding ceremony. Instead, I gave Marcus the signal. The screen behind the altar came alive. The room changed almost immediately. Conversations stopped. Heads turned toward the screen. People who had been smiling only seconds earlier suddenly looked uncertain. Nobody knew what was coming. I did. Marcus did. Raymond did. Sarah did. Emily did. And somewhere in that room, Trevor knew too. Then his own voice came through the speakers. For 43 seconds, everyone listened to Trevor speak in the flat, calm tone of someone discussing an ordinary business transaction. There was no anger in his voice, no hesitation, no emotion that could make anyone believe he had been confused or misunderstood. He explained exactly how he intended to get me to sign away control of my company at my own reception. My company. My work. The thing I had spent years building. The thing he had apparently decided should become his. He talked about it as if it were already decided. As if I were simply a person who needed to be moved into the right position so the papers could be placed in front of me and signed. He had planned to make me believe I was still in control, while quietly removing that control from my hands. Nobody in the chapel moved. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Trevor's own words had done more than anything I could have said myself. Then Diane's voice followed. Her voice was calm too, almost casual. She discussed Emily and how manageable she would be now that she was so thoroughly isolated. She spoke about her as if she were not a person with feelings, fears, memories, and a life of her own. She spoke about her as if isolation were simply another tool that could be used to control someone. That was when the chapel became completely silent. It was so quiet that I could hear the wind brushing against the stained glass. That small sound became strangely clear. The wind outside, the glass, the stillness inside. 400 people sitting together without knowing what to say. For so long, the truth had been hidden in private rooms, quiet conversations, missing objects, unexplained withdrawals, and carefully chosen words. Now, it was sitting in the middle of the chapel where everyone could see it. Sarah walked to the front. She did not rush. She carried her notebook in her hand, the same notebook she had kept for all those years. She opened it and began to read. For 4 minutes, Sarah read from her notes. 4 minutes may not sound like a long time, but inside that chapel, it felt much longer. She read the dates. She read the withdrawal records. She listed the 17 missing objects. She described what had disappeared, when it had disappeared, and what she had noticed afterward. Then she read Diane's own words. Not things Sarah had imagined. Not guesses. Not rumors. Diane's own words. Recorded and written down from moments when she had not realized anyone was paying attention. Sarah's voice remained steady. That mattered. She was not there to create a scene. She was there to tell the truth. One date after another. One withdrawal after another. One missing object after another. One statement after another. The pieces that had once seemed small and unrelated were suddenly connected. Peter stood next. He looked toward Emily first. He did not speak until he had her consent on record. Then he explained what a frightened patient looks like. He explained the difference between a person who is simply unhappy and a person who has been living under prolonged pressure and fear. He described the pattern of evidence. Not one incident, not one bad day, not one misunderstanding. A pattern. A pattern built from repeated behavior, isolation, fear, control, and evidence that continued to appear even when the people involved thought nobody was watching. Peter's words gave the room another way to understand what had happened. Some people had probably wondered why Emily had not simply spoken earlier, why she had not walked away, why she had stayed quiet, why she had allowed certain things to continue. Peter explained why frightened people do not always behave the way outsiders expect them to behave. Sometimes fear makes a person quiet. Sometimes fear makes a person agree. Sometimes fear makes a person appear calm because they have learned that showing emotion only makes things worse. The chapel remained still. Then the side door opened. Emily walked in. She was wearing a plain gray sweater. Nothing expensive, nothing dramatic, nothing chosen to make an impression. Her chin was level and she was walking on her own. She did not look at the floor. She did not look afraid. She looked tired, but she also looked free. I reached out my hand. Emily took it. She did it in front of everyone. There was no speech. There was no need for one. That single action said more than anything else could have said. She had chosen to stand beside me openly. She was no longer hiding behind someone else's story. She was no longer allowing other people to explain her life for her. For years, silence had been used against her. That morning, silence no longer belonged to them. It belonged to her. Trevor reacted almost immediately. He bolted for the exit. He moved quickly, perhaps believing that if he could simply get out of the chapel, he could get away from what had been revealed. But Raymond was already there. 2 attorneys were with him. They stood across the aisle with papers in their hands. Trevor stopped. For the first time that morning, he looked like someone who had discovered that the plan was no longer his. There was nowhere for him to turn the situation into another negotiation. There was nowhere to rewrite the story. The documents were already there. The witnesses were already there. The recordings had already been played. The people who needed to know had already heard. Diane did not run. She simply stood there in her ivory dress. For a few seconds, she looked almost exactly as she had looked earlier. Perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, almost warm. Then that constructed warmth began to fall away. It happened slowly. The smile disappeared first. Then the expression changed. What remained was difficult to describe. There was nothing recognizable left underneath it. No warmth, no concern, no family feeling. Just the flat absence of someone who had built herself almost entirely out of strategy. She had spent so much time planning what people should see that perhaps she had forgotten what remained when there was nothing left to perform. They left through the side door at 11:47 that morning. I did not arrange that detail. I did not tell anyone to make them use that door, but somehow it felt right. The front door had always been for people who belonged. That thought stayed with me. The front door was for people who came into a home with honest intentions. It was for people who brought love, friendship, respect, and truth with them. It was not for people who had entered my life carrying plans to take something from me. So they left through the side. At 11:47, the wedding never happened. The ceremony people had expected never took place. But something else happened that mattered more. The truth finally had room to breathe. The food had been prepared for 400 people. There were tables full of it. Plates, desserts, drinks. Everything that had been planned for a large celebration was still there, even though the celebration itself had disappeared. I could have sent it away. I could have told someone to throw it out. I was loved, not by Diane, not for a single day, not by someone who had been standing beside me while secretly planning how to take control of what I had built. I was loved by a wife who never once said, "I told you so." She could have. She had every reason to. She could have reminded me of every warning I had ignored. She could have pointed to every moment when she had been right and I had been wrong. But she did not. She simply
stayed. She loved me without needing to win an argument. I was loved by a daughter who protected her son at the cost of her own silence. She had carried fear because she believed that keeping Cody safe mattered more than making herself heard. She had stayed quiet not because she had nothing to say, but because she had been trying to protect someone she loved. And I was loved by a 3-year-old boy, a little boy who trusted an old man with a truth that was far too heavy for him to understand. Cody did not know the value of what he had found. He did not know what the tablet would mean. He did not know that one small act of trust could change the course of an entire family. He only knew that he had found something, and that he needed to show it to someone he trusted. Sometimes that is what courage looks like. Not a speech, not a grand gesture, not someone standing in front of hundreds of people without fear. Sometimes courage is simply telling the truth to the person you believe will listen. I nearly lost everything. Not to a stranger. That might have been easier to understand. I nearly lost everything to people I had fed at my own table. People I had welcomed into my home. People I had trusted around my family. People who knew where I kept my things, how my business worked, who I loved, what I feared, and where I was vulnerable. The danger had not come from outside. It had been sitting close enough to eat dinner with me. That was the part that hurt the most. But I got another chance. I got another chance because a child with his grandmother's eyes told me the truth. Everyone else had been too afraid to say it. Everyone else had reasons to stay quiet. Some were protecting themselves. Some were protecting someone else. Some probably believed that silence would make the problem disappear. But the truth does not disappear simply because people refuse to say it. It waits. It stays where it is. And eventually, if someone is brave enough to speak, it comes into the light. Cody did not know that. Emily did. Sarah did. Peter did. Raymond did. And eventually, I did too. That was the lesson I carried with me after everything was over. Love is not simply the person who stands beside you when everything is easy. Love is not the person who smiles at you while secretly calculating what they can take. Love is not control dressed up as concern. Love is not isolation disguised as protection. Real love has a cost. Real love requires courage. Real love tells the truth, even when the truth is painful. Real love stays when there is nothing to gain. Real love protects people who cannot protect themselves. Real love does not need to destroy someone else to make itself feel powerful. And real love does not ask you to give up who you are just to keep the peace. That's the only kind of love worth building a house around. The kind that costs something. The kind that stays when things become difficult. The kind that protects instead of controls. The kind that listens instead of manipulating. The kind that remembers what matters. The kind that can look you in the eyes and tell you the truth, even when the truth is hard. Because a house can be built from stone. It can be filled with expensive furniture. It can have beautiful gardens, long tables, photographs on the walls, and enough rooms for hundreds of guests. But none of those things make it a home. A home is built around trust. A home is built around people who can speak honestly. A home is built around people who do not make you afraid to be yourself. A home is built around the people who stay when the easy version of life disappears. That morning, I thought I had lost a wedding. By the end of that day, I understood that I had been given something much bigger. I had been given the truth. I had been given back my family. I had been given back a photograph that should never have been boxed away. I had given Sarah the position she had earned long ago. I had watched Emily breathe freely again. And I had learned that a small child, carrying nothing more than a tablet and a feather, could remind an old man what love was supposed to look like. The wedding was canceled. The lies were exposed. The people who had planned to take control were gone. The food found people who needed it. The roses remained. Margaret's photograph returned to the top of the stairs. And that night, sitting alone at my desk, I understood something I should have known much earlier. I had not been saved by money. I had not been saved by lawyers. I had not been saved by business partners. They helped bring the truth into the open. But the truth had started somewhere much smaller. It started with trust. A child trusted me enough to hand me what he had found. A daughter trusted me enough to finally walk through that door. Sarah trusted me enough to keep records when nobody wanted to listen. Peter trusted the evidence enough to explain what fear really looks like. And Emily trusted me enough to take my hand in front of 400 people. That was what saved me. Not power, not wealth. Trust.
OT wealth. Not a perfect plan. Trust.
And that is why I wrote those 3 words. I was loved.
I was loved by people who had nothing to gain from loving me. I was loved by people who had every reason to be afraid and still chose the truth. I was loved by people who did not need applause. I was loved by people who did not need control. I was loved by people who simply wanted the people they cared about to be safe. And after everything that happened, I finally understood that was enough. More than enough. It was the only thing that had ever really mattered. The kind of love worth building a house around is not perfect. It is not always comfortable. It does not always say what you want to hear. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it demands that you face something you would rather avoid. Sometimes it asks you to admit that you were wrong. Sometimes it asks you to stand beside someone when the entire room is watching. But it tells the truth, even when the truth is hard. Especially when the truth is hard. And after everything I had lost, everything I had nearly lost, and everything I had been given back, I knew one thing for certain. That was the kind of love I wanted around me for the rest of my life. The kind that costs something. The kind that protects. The kind that stays. The kind that tells the truth. The kind that gives a frightened person room to breathe again. The kind that lets a child remain innocent. The kind that puts a photograph back where it belongs. The kind that recognizes the people who have quietly carried a family for years. The kind that does not ask for anything in return. That was the kind of love worth building a house around. And finally, after all those years, I knew I was home.